What if the greatest empire Europe ever birthed didn't fall, but was buried alive, suffocated by its own bloodline? For 6 centuries, the Habsburgs pulled the strings of kings, popes, and empires, then vanished like smoke in the wind. No uprising, no blaze of glory, just silence. A dynasty so tangled in power, marriage, and madness that their family tree looked more like a noose. They crowned continents, married the world, and ruled where the sun refused to set, until it all cracked under the weight of whispers, wars, and traitors with pens sharper than any sword. This isn't history. It's a ticking time bomb sealed in royal wax. And it's finally bleeding through. 1273, the night air pressed heavy over the Rhine Valley, and somewhere beneath it, a name stirred like thunder beneath earth. No one knew it yet. Not the kings with golden crowns. Not the dukes bleeding gold into foreign wars. Not the peasants snapping twigs in the frostbitten woods. But something ancient had just cracked open, and its echo would outlive them all. Rudolph, just a count. A man with mud on his boots and steel in his eyes. No divine birthright. No vaults of treasure. Just ambition, raw, restless, unblinking. And when the imperial crown fell unclaimed, rotting from the heads of dead emperors, he didn't wait. He took it. No trumpet blast. No flood of roses. Just one man clawing his way up the spine of a fractured empire. And with that single move, the Habsburg name left the soil and entered the bloodstream of Europe. But this was no fairy tale ascent. This was survival by calculation, by marriage, by power disguised as patience. A crown is easy to lose in battle, but a womb? A womb can win kingdoms forever. They didn't sharpen swords. They sharpened bloodlines. Each union was a needle, stitched not in love, but in legacy. Hungary, Bohemia, Burgundy, the Low Countries. They didn't conquer. They seduced, wrapped entire regions in velvet vows and veiled threats. Sons were born not out of desire, but strategy. Daughters weren't daughters. They were pawns in veils, whispered away into foreign lands with rings heavier than chains. And it worked. Like dark alchemy, Austria was the keystone. Its forests, rivers, and castles became the Habsburg lungs, breathing power, expanding reach. The crown of Austria didn't just sit on a head, it rooted into the veins. They wore it like bone. Every rival watched in horror. How do you fight an enemy who doesn't invade, but marries your heir, baptizes your bloodline, and smiles as your throne withers? Then came Maximilian. Tall, cold-eyed, impossible to read. The kind of man who said little but moved everything. In 1477, he bound himself to Mary of Burgundy, not just for her, but for the land she held like a torch. The Burgundian inheritance, rivers of silk, cities lit by gold, vaults stuffed with ancient power. Overnight, the Habsburgs became continental. A dynasty once chained to alpine stone now reached the sea. But it didn't stop. It never stopped. In 1496, another quiet wedding, so easy to miss. Maximilian's son married Joanna of Castile. Spain, the Indies, the Atlantic, lands where the maps bled into monsters. The marriage looked like a royal formality, but it was a coronation in disguise. And then the child, Charles, born in 1500. One face, half Flemish, half Iberian. One voice, heavy with Latin, Dutch, and prayer. The moment he cried in the womb, the world shifted. He didn't inherit a kingdom. He inherited the known world. Castile, Aragon, Naples, Burgundy, Austria, the Holy Roman Empire, the New World. When Charles walked, the continents followed. But the whispers had started. Even then, too much power, too much land. One boy, crowned by too many ghosts. The Habsburg blood had stretched too far. The marriages had worked too well. What they had stitched now threatened to split from the seams. The nobles blinked. The church twitched. Enemies circled. But Charles didn't blink. Not once. Not when he wore the imperial crown at 19. Not when he stood before popes and kings. Not when he held half the world in his ink-stained hands and called it duty. He was everything the Habsburgs had schemed for, and everything they had to fear. His empire was vast, but not bound by stone. It was bound by names, by treaties, by the rotting ink of 1,000 marriage contracts. It was stitched with tension, fueled by debts, poisoned by the same ambition that gave it life. There was no thunderous war, no cavalry charge, just the quiet ticking of something too big, too heavy, a thing that could not be held, even by hands bred for it. And as Charles sat on his golden thrones, one in Madrid, one in Vienna, Another scattered in parchment across the seas. He felt it. The weight. The inheritance was not a gift. It was a curse. But the world didn't know that yet. The name Habsburg had become a shadow, slipping under doors, threading through bloodlines, haunting palaces. It was no longer just a dynasty. It was an idea. A whisper no one could kill. Not yet, because the fire hadn't started. But the smoke was already in the walls. A storm brewed, but no thunder came. Just a boy, 19 years old, kneeling in a chapel thick with the stench of incense and candle wax. His hands trembled as they touched the crown, not from weakness, but from something darker. He knew what this meant. It wasn't just gold and velvet. It was a noose spun from centuries of promises. In that moment, 1519, Charles became emperor, not of one land, but of everything between the Arctic winds and the jungles of the New World. Spain, the Low Countries, Austria, Naples, Milan, the Holy Roman Empire, the Americas. Too much for any man. He didn't inherit an empire. He inherited a fire. The Spanish throne burned with gold and conquest, Aztec blood still drying in the dirt, silver pouring from Potosi like it could drown the devil himself. In the north, the Low Countries pulsed like a coin purse ready to burst. The Alps held Austria like a clenched fist. And across the Atlantic, lands no European had yet seen whispered seduction and revolt in the same breath. But none of that would matter, because one man had already torn the map in two, with nothing but ink and rage. 1517, Martin Luther's hammer struck the church door in Wittenberg, but it hit the spine of Christendom. By the time Charles took his imperial oath, Christ was already split. Princes were siding with heresy. Bishops were turning their backs. The very cross he swore to protect had splintered. The church wanted Charles to crush it. But how do you crush a ghost inside your own house? He summoned Luther to Worms in 1521. A trial? No. It was a duel without swords. Luther stood firm, eyes lit with the kind of fire that makes men immortal. "Here I stand," he said. "I can do no other." Charles clenched his jaw. He could have killed him on the spot, burned him like so many others. But something held him back. Perhaps it was politics, or prophecy, or fear. Because while the empire bled from within, another monster stirred outside. The Ottomans. Suleiman was not a name. He was a shadow with teeth. In 1526, his armies crushed Hungary like a wine glass. At Mohacs, the Hungarian king drowned in mud as Christian knights screamed for a god who didn't answer. Now Vienna stood exposed, its cathedrals shaking in the wind, its people silent under the weight of what might come. Charles couldn't breathe. The empire was too vast. The Reformation pulled one arm. The Turks snapped at the other. And behind him, France. Always France. The Valois kings hated him. They saw his empire and called it theft. Francis I wanted Italy, wanted Burgundy, wanted glory. He found war instead. In 1525, Charles struck back with iron. Pavia. Francis was captured, dragged from his horse like a dog, thrown in chains, and locked in a Spanish cell. The French king, caged, humiliated. And still, it wasn't enough. Victory only fed the fire. Europe was not a land anymore. It was a fever. Cities rioted. Princes plotted. Cardinals whispered treason behind stained glass. Charles aged 10 years in every 5. His skin yellowed. His hands shook. His soul, once convinced God had chosen him, now doubted the heavens were even watching. He wrote letters at night, candles burning low, begging God for unity, for peace, for strength. None came. The Reformation hardened. The Ottomans regrouped. France clawed back. Even nature betrayed him. Storms wrecked his fleets. Plagues chewed through his cities. Gold poured in from the New World, but inflation turned it to ash in men's hands. By 1547, he crushed the Protestant League. The empire held, for a moment, but something inside him broke. He stopped speaking of destiny. He stopped believing he could fix it. The crown didn't sit on his head anymore. It sank into his skull. So, in 1556, Charles did what no emperor had done. He walked away. No orchestra, no parade. Just a man, old before his time, signing away the world with fingers that could barely hold a quill. To his brother Ferdinand went the Holy Roman Empire, fractured, burning. To his son Philip went Spain, restless, ambitious, and cursed with the same burden. Charles retired to a monastery in Yusti. Not to pray, not to reflect, but to wait. Wait for silence. Wait for death. Wait to forget the sound of a world he could no longer control. But even there, in the walls of stone and shadow, the empire lived on, scratching at the doors, whispering in Latin through the cracks. The sun had not set. It only burned lower. The palace was dead silent. Not a whisper, not a step, just the heavy breath of stone. Outside, the Spanish wind beat against the walls like fists begging for entry. Inside, Philip II sat alone, draped in black, spine stiff, eyes locked on a crucifix that never blinked back. El Escorial, built not for beauty, but for God and death. A granite tomb disguised as a royal court. Windowless chambers, endless corridors, silence sharpened to a blade. It was not a home. It was a cathedral made for penance, a place where kings were buried before they died. Here ruled Philip, the king who did not laugh, who did not bend, who believed with a fire so fierce it could scorch an empire. 1588. He launched it. The Armada. Not a fleet, a sermon in sails. Hundreds of ships. Thousands of men. The sea itself groaned beneath the weight of it. It wasn't a war, it was judgment. Protestant England would kneel, or it would burn. But the winds had their own faith. Storms ripped the Holy Fleet apart like paper. Hulls shattered on Irish shores. Bodies floated face down in the name of God. England stood. Philip prayed harder. His Spain still ruled the gold, still ruled the sun. But something was shifting. Something slow. Something cold. Austria, meanwhile, stood in the shadows. Ferdinand I, brother, heir, survivor, held the crumbling Holy Roman Empire with both hands, knuckles white. The crown was his, but not the unity. He stitched Protestant and Catholic princes into uneasy peace, a patchwork over a ticking bomb. Time passed. Faces changed. But underneath it all, the old cracks widened. 1618, Prague. A window. A shove. Two Catholic officials thrown into the void by Protestant nobles, out the castle and into hell. They didn't die, but the empire did. 30 years of agony began. No borders. No rules. Just war. Cities razed. Families butchered. Armies starved and marched again. Cannons shattered stained glass. Corpses lined rivers. Faith meant nothing anymore. Only fire. Only blood. Vienna held. Barely. The Habsburgs poured silver into the war like water into a dying throat. Spain, stretched across continents, began to crack. The gold from the New World fed battles, fed debts, fed ghosts. The sun still rose over their lands, but the shadows were longer now, sharper. Still, amid the burning, they built. Baroque. Not just art. A scream in marble. Churches soared like threats. Paintings bled color like wounds. Music pounded like war drums beneath divine whispers. Vienna. Madrid. Prague. Cities bathed in gold and rot. This was glory forced through gritted teeth. But inside the palaces, something was wrong. Children coughed in cradles. Faces twisted. Bloodlines looped where they should have branched. The Habsburg jaw, elongated, clenched, grotesque, began to speak for itself. Cousin married cousin. Uncles became fathers. The blood thinned. By 1665, Spain was ruled by the fragile hands of a boy king who never should have lived. Charles II, born with a body broken from birth. Unable to chew. Unable to lead. Surrounded by whispering priests and desperate ministers. A monarch in name only. The empire bled while courtiers argued over which foreign hand would take the dying crown. Philip II's silence had become a curse. Vienna pressed on. Battle after battle. Treaties signed with trembling hands. Spain stumbled behind. Like an aging lion unaware its mane had turned to ash. They had ruled the seas. They had crowned continents. They had danced with God himself. Now they stared at themselves in dim mirrors, searching for what they once were. But no one answered. Because the ghosts were already in the walls. The room reeked of sweat and incense. Candles flickered in tight clusters, their wax bleeding down iron holders like veins drained dry. 1700 Madrid. The body of Charles II lay twisted in its final silence. Eyes open, mouth slightly parted. The jaw, the infamous Habsburg jaw, frozen in death, as if still gasping for air that no longer cared to enter. He left no heir, no plan, no future, just a crown heavy with a curse, passed like a torch into a powder keg, and the world lit the match. The War of the Spanish Succession didn't start with armies. It started with a vacuum, a hole in the heart of Europe that sucked in kings, egos, and empires. Austria wanted the crown. France wanted the crown. Everyone wanted the throne of a dead man whose blood had curdled centuries ago. Gunpowder roared. Borders cracked. bodies stacked like firewood in winter. When it ended in 1714, Spain was never the same. The Bourbon line took the throne. The Habsburg eagle, torn from Iberia, retreated east, wings scorched but not broken. Austria stood alone now. Not as shadow, not as extension, as identity. But identity in Vienna meant control. And that control now rested on a woman, Maria Theresa. 1740, her father gone. Her claim doubted. Enemies circling like wolves who smelled not blood, but a woman. They thought her soft, weak, decorative. She answered with steel. Pregnant, grieving, nearly bankrupt, she wore the crown like armor. She faced down Prussia, France, Bavaria. She fought not just for Austria, but for continuity, for the name that refused to die, for the spine of a world that bent beneath the weight of change. But what she gave in strength, she paid in silence. The empire was stable, yes, but strained, cracked beneath velvet, and her son would feel it all. Joseph too. Reform wasn't his idea. It was his obsession. He walked the palace halls like a ghost with too many thoughts and too little patience. He didn't want to reign, he wanted to remake. He tore at tradition like a mad surgeon. No more torture, no more feudal privilege, religious tolerance, bureaucratic efficiency, education, vaccination. He wrote edicts like a man scribbling against time itself. He burned the old world and tried to build a new one on its ashes. But his people flinched. Nobles hissed. Priests turned their eyes away. The more he pushed, the more they resisted. By the time he died in 1790, he was alone, unmarried, childless, buried in an unmarked tomb by his own order. The empire was still standing, but now it trembled. Then came the real earthquake. Napoleon, not a king, not a noble, just a soldier with fire in his eyes and Europe in his grip. He humiliated the Habsburgs with every breath, crushed their armies, married their daughters, forced Francis II, last Holy Roman Emperor, to erase his own crown in 1806. A title 1,000 years old vanished in ink and shame. So the Habsburgs changed the script again. Not Holy Roman Emperors now, Emperors of Austria. A new title, same hunger. They waited, they watched, they endured. And when Napoleon finally fell, frozen, bled out, alone on foreign soil, they struck. 1815, the Congress of Vienna. It wasn't just diplomacy. It was revenge carved in policy. The Habsburgs sat at the center like judges, redrawing borders, restoring kings, rewinding the clock on revolution. They stitched the world back together with threads soaked in nostalgia. But nostalgia doesn't feed the hungry. It doesn't silence the voices rising from the cracks. The peasants in Galicia, the Hungarians boiling under silence, the Czechs with ink-stained hands, the Italians with fire in their lungs, all chained to a crown that ruled with paper and prayer. And then, 1848, the year silence died. It started with a tremble, a pamphlet here, a protest there, then gunshots, then barricades, then Vienna itself in flames. Students fought in the streets. Soldiers fired into crowds. Ministers fled through smoke. The emperor hid behind iron gates as his empire screamed from within. Revolution was not a wave. It was an earthquake. And no one, not even the Habsburgs, could stop the ground from splitting. It was a June morning in Sarajevo, 1914. The sun had risen like any other, warm on cobbled streets, calm on the river's surface, but the air trembled. Something unseen pressed against the lungs of the city. The Archduke's motorcade crept through the crowd, an open car rolling through fate like it didn't recognize its own weight. Smiles, handshakes, waving hands, then a pistol. Sharp, sudden, a sound too loud for the street. One shot tore through history. Another followed. Blood bloomed on white uniforms. Franz Ferdinand slumped. His wife collapsed beside him. For a moment, silence. The kind that doesn't soothe, it deafens. That was the end of the man, but not of what he carried. An empire held together by threads had just snapped. They had tried everything. In 1867, the Austrians had looked at their empire's splintering soul and stitched a compromise, the dual monarchy. 2 crowns, 1 emperor. 1 empire, split like a heart cracked in 2. Austria and Hungary, parallel realms pretending unity. They called it balance. But the threads were fraying. Not just in Vienna and Budapest, but in the whispers of the Czechs, in the clenched fists of Slovaks, in the uneasy silence of Croats, Serbs, Romanians, each one staring at the imperial center with growing resentment. It was not peace. It was pause. Franz Joseph, I sat like granite in the middle of it all, a crown that weighed more with each passing year. He reigned for nearly 70 years, longer than most empires endure. His face became the symbol of something old and stubborn, something proud and afraid. He buried his wife, Empress Elizabeth, stabbed to death by an anarchist in 1898. He buried his only son, Rudolf, who died in a suicide pact at Mayerling. He buried hope and kept ruling. No joy, only duty. He aged with the walls of Schönbrunn, brittle and cracked beneath golden paint. And still, the people waited for something to change or collapse. In Hungary, nationalism pulsed like a fever. They wanted more autonomy, more pride, more space to breathe. In the Balkans, the Slavs grew louder. Serbs dreamed of uniting the southern Slavs under one flag, and Vienna watched with clenched jaws. Every new language printed, every anthem sung, every statue erected in another tongue. It was not culture. It was defiance. But no one dared move first. They feared the unraveling. The empire was not a nation. It was a dam holding back a flood. Then came June 28, 1914. The gunman was Gavrilo Princip, a name unknown that morning, immortal by evening. He didn't just kill a man. He struck at the myth of control. He shattered the illusion that the Habsburgs could keep the pieces together. Austria-Hungary issued an ultimatum to Serbia. It wasn't diplomacy. It was bait. Serbia refused some demands. War followed. And like dominoes, Europe tumbled into madness. By August 1914, the Great War had begun. Austria-Hungary marched to war with fading strength and blind faith. They thought they would crush Serbia in weeks. Instead, they were swallowed by mud and blood. On the Eastern Front, Russian soldiers pushed them back like wind against an old barn. In the south, Italy turned on them. In the west, allies like Germany saw the empire not as a partner, but a burden. Inside the empire, people starved. Bread lines twisted through cities. Winter bit hard in Vienna and Budapest. In Galicia, peasants froze in villages stripped bare. The army sent boys to die in Carpathian snows for hills no one remembered. Men who didn't speak the same language fought beside each other, silent, confused, afraid. Some deserted. Some switched sides. The loyalty that once held this empire in place melted like snow in spring. Franz Joseph died in 1916. His death was not shocking. It was expected, even merciful. He had carried the crown like a chain. His great-nephew Karl took the throne, a boy king in a house already burning. He tried to make peace. He begged for ceasefires. He wept in private. But the war no longer belonged to kings. In 1917, Bolsheviks seized Russia. Revolution bled into the east. Socialists and nationalists saw their chance. Czechs formed legions abroad. Croats refused to fight for Vienna. Slavs spoke of freedom in voices that could no longer be silenced. Every shell that fell on a trench also cracked the walls of the empire. And still, the emperor prayed. He wrote letters. He held ceremonies. While the world shifted beneath his feet. By the autumn of 1918, the end came like a final cough from a dying man. October turned leaves red and brown and turned parliaments against Vienna. The Czechs declared independence. The Hungarians broke from the Union. The South Slavs formed a kingdom of their own. Like glass dropped on a marble floor, the empire shattered. Austria-Hungary ceased to exist, not with ceremony, but with hunger, chaos, and rage. In November, Karl fled. Not deposed with swords or mobs. Just gone. He called it suspension. The world called it abdication. He died in exile. His children never ruled. And what was left behind? Broken cities. Fractured states. Borders redrawn with trembling hands. A continent rebuilt with bitterness as its foundation. The map changed, but the memories did not. Nationalism, once the poison that cracked the empire, would later flood Europe like a rising tide. And the Habsburg ghost? It lingers. In Vienna's palaces, empty and echoing. In Budapest's riverbanks, where the past looks through statues. In Sarajevo's streets, where blood once answered a crown. The dynasty that ruled for centuries now survives in museums, in names etched on stone, in the spaces between languages spoken across a continent once ruled by one house. One house that tried to rule many. One house that could not hold what it had built. The empire didn't collapse in a roar. It crumbled in whispers.